Good rainy morning to everyone. I'm Athena Peralta. I work as Program Executive for Economic and Ecological Justice at the World Council of Churches. And it's really a big pleasure for me to welcome you here to the Ecumenical Center on behalf of the WCC. Welcome also to this event titled Debriefing COP23 from Faith and Ethical Perspectives. This is being brought to you by the Geneva Interfaith Forum on Climate Change, Environment, and Human Rights, comprised of the WCC, the Brahma, Kumaris, Franciscans International, among others. As you know, faith-based organizations have been long engaged in the climate negotiation process of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And they have, in these discussions, brought in a perspective on faith and compassion in order to inspire and encourage decision makers to include people and Mother Earth and the rest of creation in their deliberations. So this event this morning has at least 4 aims. What we want to do is to share our views on the contribution of faith-based organizations during the most recently concluded climate negotiations, or COP23, held last November in Bonn, which was, of course, presided over by Fiji. And we also want to discuss the contribution of faith-based organizations in the Talanoa dialogue toward the effective implementation of the Paris Agreement. We also want to be able to coordinate faith-based organizations in preparation for the next COP24, which will be held in Katowice, Poland in December 2018. And of course, on a more deeper level, we want to be able to strengthen the link between climate change negotiations in the UN FCCC framework and the UN human rights mechanisms. So the program that we have today is actually in 2 parts. The first part is the more public event, which will be comprised of 2 panels. The first panel will focus on evaluating COP23 from faith and human rights perspectives. And the second panel will talk more about the role of faith-based organizations in the Talanoa dialogue. But there is also a working meeting following this public session with the aim of strategizing for a more effective and meaningful engagement by FBOs in the next COP. So I think that is the introduction for this event. And now we go into our first panel. We have with us, as you can see, we have like a full table here. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 panelists with us, one who will be joining, or rather will be giving a video message. But first, we will be having Mr. Isaiah Toroitich. He is from Kenya, and he is a global advocacy and policy coordinator in ACT Alliance. I think I will quickly introduce all 4, and then we can begin. So after Isaiah, we will hear from Mr. Benjamin Schachter, who is a focal point on climate change and environment at the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. Benjamin will then be followed by Mr. David Mate Dore, who is a director of the Indigenous Peoples Center for Documentation, Research, and Information. And then we will have a video intervention coming from Reverend Fletcher Harper, and he is the Executive Director of Green Faith. And to wrap up the first panel, we will then have Ms. Valeriane Bernard, who is a representative of the Brahma Kumaris to the United Nations. So with that introduction, I hand over to Isaiah.
Thank you so much. Athena, and thank you for organizing this, and many thanks to the partners as well for putting this together. We think it's really important to come together, evaluate, take stock of what happened in Bonn, and plan for what needs to take place this year and the years to come. ACT Alliance is a network of churches and church-based organizations that work on development, humanitarian work, and advocacy. It actually is the largest Protestant and Orthodox network of this nature, and it was created in 2010 by the Lutheran World Federation and the World Council of Churches. I think this is important to say because, in a sense, it is important to see our alliance as an expression of the ecumenical work or prophetic diaconical work of churches. And so much of our climate change advocacy started since our formation in 2010, and we have been quite keen to do advocacy. We've focused quite a lot on the processes under the UNFCCC, but also on processes that are outside of the convention. We have been part and parcel of ecumenical and interfaith campaigns and mobilization. We have had quite a significant amount of policy work, including policy dialogue, in the context of negotiations towards the creation of the Paris Agreement. And so if you look at the work of ACT Alliance on climate change, it is framed from a climate justice perspective, just like the work of most of the people seated around the table is. And we have been quite keen to look at the concept of resilience, yet to be defined, but looking at it in the context of climate change from the adaptation policy arena, as well as loss and damage. We have also worked quite a lot on the changing of our development paradigm, otherwise called low carbon development or low greenhouse gas development. And we've worked as well on climate finance and gender and human rights. I say this because from our perspective, COP23 sort of did not meet much of our ambition with regards to those three areas, and I will speak to them in a few minutes. But as we went to COP23, and I recall having conversations with our colleagues here, it was an exciting moment because our expectations were high. This was the very first conference of the parties to be organized by a Pacific island. So it was quite exciting to see that. It also happened against a backdrop where there were quite an incredible amount of climate-related events, disastrous events. And so if you look at 2017 and look at the amount of work that we did as a humanitarian organization or a humanitarian network with regards to floods and droughts and hurricanes and other things, it was a difficult year. And so COP23 came right at a time when climate change was literally in the lips of people. And so we kind of had quite a huge amount of expectation that it would deliver in that regard. We also had a keen perspective related to scaling up transparency with regards to climate change action. As you recall, Paris Agreement, which received quite a significant support even from our network, starts to be implemented. And then the question of how it is implemented becomes quite pertinent because as an agreement, you could implement it in the most unambitious way possible and the most the way that's not as transparent as it should be. And so we have been quite keen to ask and seek for greater ambition, greater transparency, greater accountability with regards to implementing this agreement. And so in a sense, that was the backdrop, those were the dynamics that were happening within our policy discussions and conversations. And then we went to COP23. As with many other organizations, we did what we do, run side events here and there, mobilize young people and faith leaders, be part and parcel of lobby activities, develop policy alternatives that would be tabled within negotiations, for example. As ACT Alliance, we were quite privileged to have quite a bit of access. We had several pink badges, and so we had some of our representatives from mostly from the global south, being embedded within government negotiations and accessing these negotiations. And it was quite important to be able to bring the voice of faith communities and faith leaders into these negotiations. And I think apart from trying to do that and being part of coordination and capacity building and media and communications, there was, in my opinion, quite a significant input from the faith networks that were in COP23. I think part of it was a sign of solidarity with the COP presidency, and part of it as well, I think, was related very much to the fact that climate change is increasingly becoming very important for our work. It is becoming very important for lives and livelihoods, particularly in the communities that we serve. And so climate justice and climate change, in spite of the fact that we have an agreement, a solid Paris agreement, is still something that we have to push for and that we have to work for. The work did not end in 2015. In fact, it just started. And so that is the kind of framing and the tone that we had in Bonn. I'd like to take the next couple of minutes to just give our impression of the outcome. And I will do it following the three areas that I spoke about. In terms of the continuous building of community resilience and building the capability of communities to thrive in spite of the impacts of climate change, we feel quite strongly that the momentum isn't there yet. We feel that the political momentum is starting to fade a little bit, not only as a result or linked to what's happening in the USA, but also much of it is linked to the fact that action and policy seem to be contradicting. I mean, if you look at what is required to deal with loss and damage, it's quite significant. If you look at the NDCs, the nationally determined contributions on the table, they are quite weak. And so there's this contradiction between policy and action, but also between reality and the conversation happening within the convention, but also happening within other spaces that create policy framework. And so we feel that that is, COP23 was a missed opportunity in that regard. We had, for example, a very strong desire to bring loss and damage more as a key pillar of climate action, as has been determined by the Paris Agreement. However, the attempt to make loss and damage a permanent agenda on the subsidiary bodies was not accepted, and so that failed. If you look at the concept of financing and supporting loss and damage, that was also not successful. And so we feel quite strongly that there is still quite a bit of work to be done in that area, and there is quite a bit of questions to be asked as to the commitment of parties and of governments, as well as other actors to meet those things. I would, however, hasten to speak about some of the positive things that we noted with regards to resilience. I think it was good that the Adaptation Fund, which is an important fund for developing countries, has now been formally linked to the Paris Agreement. There was a decision that the Adaptation Fund would serve the Paris Agreement. I think it was also positive to note some of the pledges and contributions of some governments to this fund, as well as to the least developed countries fund, I think to the tune of $90 million US. And we also think that the work plan or the work program of the Warsaw International Mechanism, the 5-year work plan, rolling work plan, it's good that it was adopted. And so there are things that we can do to still push for ambition and push for seriousness with regards to these issues. If you look at the other things that we had in mind for our advocacy and campaigning, for example, the development of the Paris Rulebook and the finalization of guidelines, or at least concretizing guidelines that would help with the implementation of the Paris Agreement. That progress, not as significantly as we hoped, but there is a hope that this year will give some signs of positive movement forward. There will be, I believe, an additional session to finalize on this, and so we hope that COP23, COP24 will give us that. I now have 2 minutes, and I think I will wrap. So in a sense, I guess what is important is to draw these contradiction and to see whether this is a space for our advocacy moving forward, and how we can mobilize increasing support for climate action at all levels. I think the other crunch thing that was very hard to watch was the failure of developed countries to honor some of their pledges. For example, the commitment under Article 9.5 of the Paris Agreement related to financial accounting. That was completely disastrous, and so we would be very interested in looking at how we can work on that moving forward. Talking about a couple of positive things, I think it was important to see that the Gender Action Plan was adopted. That was really good. I think it was also significant to see that the local communities and indigenous platform was created. It is quite important, because those are also good signs to look at and to build on. Lastly, from my perspective, the fact that all these things I've talked about were happening in the bone zone. There were some really, really interesting things happening within civil society and outside of the negotiations. And that is something we need to have a conversation about. If you look at the growing voices that are asking for phasing out of fossil fuels, coal specifically, that's stronger than ever before. If you look at the counter narrative of people and cities in the USA speaking about the fact that they're still in, that is quite significant. And so we need to consider how our actions inside the convention processes can be complemented or leveraged through our actions outside of that. I will stop there, but just basically say that we believe in ACT Alliance that the role of faith-based organizations and faith leaders is still as important as it was before, maybe even more important right now, because the kind of language we bring, but also the kind of commitment we make as organizations is significant. At the end of COP23, ACT Alliance, together with the Lutheran World Federation, made this call for solidarity with the people that are affected by climate change. And I would just like to bring that to your attention and say that still our voices, our commitments, our narrative is an important contribution to the process. But I think more than ever before, our voices need to be louder. And we need to hold governments even more accountable to the commitments they made under the Paris Agreement, but also to commitments and obligations that they have for human rights and justice. Thank you.
Thank you, Isaiah. And we can now hear from Benjamin.
Thank you, Athena, and thank you to the sponsors for inviting the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights to take part in this event. And I'm Ben. I'm the focal point on climate change and environment at the office. I think I know many of you already, but just tell you a little bit about what the office has done since COP21. We've been engaging regularly at the UNFCCC. And participating in a number of events, organizing and advocating directly with parties and others. And we've had the pleasure of working a great deal with civil society, including, again, many of you here in the room. So what I'm going to do is briefly share with you some perspectives from the office regarding progress and lack thereof, and I think I agree with, I'm sorry, was it Isaiah or? Yes, it was. Isaiah on many of what, the things he said about feeling some disappointment about the lack of progress, but at the same time, not necessarily having expected much more at COP23, knowing that it's kind of the pending deadline of COP24 for adoption of the guidelines for implementation of the Paris Agreement that is going to have to force essentially countries into action. And I think we kind of see in these negotiations and in UNFCCC processes the sort of playing out of human nature and a sort of procrastination. So, you know, if the deadlines for getting this work done is, you know, COP24, that sometimes maybe there will be a lot of discussion and not much progress until the very end. So certainly what will be important is that everybody stay engaged and continue to push for integration of human rights and climate action, because really the critical year is every year, and we always need to say that, but the critical year right now is this one. So COP23, some areas where I think we saw progress, there was a real proliferation of events, and these serve a function in terms of raising awareness, in terms of socializing negotiators, familiarizing them with these concepts, and making kind of the idea of integrating human rights and climate action a little less frightening. And so I think we should be past that point, but the reality is we still do need to keep pushing on every front that we can. And so at COP23, I would say one good thing is there really was a lot of energy and a lot of support for events related to human rights, but also related to participation, women's empowerment and gender equality, indigenous peoples' rights, and those events, I think we see that they're continuing to increase in kind of scope, effectiveness, audience, and that if we continue to work from that angle, hopefully we'll make even more progress. So OHCHR organized in, participated in a number of events. We worked on just transition with ILO. We worked on gender equality with UN Women. We worked on environmental human rights defenders. And I think most interestingly, with the support of Fiji, we were able to organize for the first time a presidency event at a COP on human rights and climate change. And that event was opened by the Prime Minister of Fiji, the President of the Marshall Islands participated, Minister of Costa Rica, a representative of the Moroccan presidency, and the Deputy High Commissioner for Human Rights. And this was also the first time we had the sort of senior level representation of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights at the COP. And so, again, I think in that sense, we see a lot of movement. Another area where there were a number of events and where I see really potential for spurring and catalyzing action is in the area of climate litigation. And that discussion is really important because when things are going slowly at the UNFCCC and in the context of international negotiations, there are other avenues to pursue. And I think it was really great that a number of civil society organizations took the opportunity of having people together at the COP to talk precisely about this subject, and about how domestic action can be catalyzed through effective litigation, including litigation based on international human rights standards and norms. We also had the opportunity to bring a couple of experts from the treaty bodies. So from the Committee on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, we had Nala Haidar, who's been leading the work on the drafting of a general recommendation on climate change and disaster risk reduction by CEDA. And from the Committee on the Rights of the Child, we had Cephas Lumina, and they participated. What's it? Oh, okay. Sorry. They participated in a number of events as well. So all of these things I'm saying just lead to and help kind of push the discussion forward. And that's a big part of the work we're doing. It's a big part of the work that civil society's doing and needs to continue to be done. Moving on to what actually happened at the negotiations, what can we take away from it? There are some positives. The adoption of the first Gender Action Plan included explicit reference to human rights and to the other sort of human rights or ethical principles contained in the preamble to the Paris Agreement, and represents in and of itself, a continuation of a long and important stream of work at the UNFCCC, which started many years ago, and where there has been substantial progress. So that's a positive. The local communities and indigenous platform I won't discuss too much because I think David will. And then the agricultural discussion and the discussion of food security made some tiny steps, but steps nonetheless towards sort of unfreezing. And this is a discussion which has been ongoing at the UNFCCC for a long time without too much progress. So we can see that there will hopefully be even more movement there in the future, particularly if people continue to push on this issue, which is so critical. I'm being told 2 minutes, so moving on to kind of, I won't say the bad because it's not done yet, but the area which is a primary focus of our work in advocacy and critical to future work on climate change, and by this I mean future work for the indefinite future, is the guidelines for implementation of the Paris Agreement. And so we've been working hard to push for the integration of human rights in these guidelines in order to operationalize the preamble of the Paris Agreement, in order to make it so that parties actually have to think about that language every time they're doing anything really at the UNFCCC. And in that regard, we held a couple of events with negotiators, and particularly we were aiming to influence, we're aiming to influence everything, but nationally determined contributions are a particular area of focus. So the guidelines for implementation, in the lead up, there was one and only one reference to human rights in submissions of parties related to different aspects of the guidelines for implementation of the Paris Agreement. So nationally determined contributions, transparency, adaptation, global stocktake, et cetera. And that reference was by Norway, and it was about voluntary guidelines for integration of human rights within nationally determined contributions. And this is the area we think actually is really critical. And so we had a meeting with negotiators from roughly 25 state delegations where we informally discussed whether or not we could take that language forward or a proposal like it. And that discussion will be ongoing. After that meeting, there was a second call for submissions, and we see now that Norway, Canada, and the African group of negotiators, as well as a fourth anonymous party, have proposed similar language on integration of human rights and NDCs. But the reality is, overall, there wasn't a ton of progress on the guidelines for implementation. There was a lot of talk of process. There definitely is a lot remaining to be done to make sure that human rights and human rights principles are integrated throughout the guidelines for implementation. So in the context of other areas, and in the context of the actual co-facilitators' notes, we're not seeing human rights. We're seeing some relevant principles, things, participation, gender equality, et cetera. But what we really need to do is mobilize around ensuring these principles make it into the guidelines which are adopted at COP24 in Paris. And there's an opportunity to do that by meeting now and pushing now on states that might be sympathetic, by engaging with the Talanoa dialogue, which is a process which will be discussed later this afternoon, ways to do that. But it's really important to sort of continue that advocacy and push for integration of human rights and these different aspects of the guidelines. The last thing I wanted to raise is that we also see in the context of discussions of Article 6, multiple references to human rights. And I think it's because this is actually an area where parties are more familiar conceptually with the idea of having human rights safeguards, for example, when you're talking about a finance mechanism or something like that. And so there's maybe a little bit less fear of that discussion. The important thing is to continue to try to dispel these fears when we're talking about human rights in other contexts. And again, thank you for the opportunity to speak. Sorry if I took a bit more time. I'll stop there and happy to discuss later.
Thank you, Benjamin. And now we will hear from David.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for the invitation. I will share with you what happened since COP21. And because we have a very particular role in the process and working in collaboration with indigenous people. We are quite a newbie organization in the UNFCCC. We started during the COP21. And at the COP22, French-speaking and Russian-speaking indigenous people ask us to be with them during all the COP and all the meeting in May, in order to allow them to work at a better level among themselves and with other stakeholders, states, and other constituencies. We don't do any lobby or advocacy. We are a support NGO, so we provide only services to just people, like providing interpreter and translation of document for their own meeting and for all the negotiation. It's crucial for them because they need it in the negotiation, but also once they do public events. Since the COP21, they have an indigenous pavilion in the public zone, which is very important, and for them important as much as what happened in the negotiation zone, in order to show to the world what is happening in the different regions of the world and the different challenges that indigenous people face around the world. But when we start to work with them, we discover that they request us to be in the UNFCCC process because they would like to have a specific space like in other body of the UN. You might know there is a permanent forum on indigenous issue under the ECOSOC in New York each year. There is in Geneva the expert mechanism on the right of indigenous people, which is a subsidiary body of the Human Rights Council. So it's specific space which are designed for them, where there is a guarantee they can always speak and bring their own issue. And when they start to work in other process of the UN, they face a lot of challenge to be recognized as a specific group or constituency. And it's why they ask us to work with them, because they would like to have a specific space. And they know when we are here, we start to negotiate with the Secretariat, with states, in order to be sure that we can provide our services everywhere in the conference, which, for example, involve to bring interpreter in the negotiation zone and not under regular accreditation, but having some like a technical staff. So this kind of services actually create a specific space for indigenous people, and it's guarantee that they are recognized as a specific groups and not mixed with all the other constituencies. So we work in deep collaboration with the International Indigenous People Forum on Climate Change, which has been established in 2008, which is the indigenous constituencies. It's organized with indigenous delegates from the 7 regions of the world, which is used by indigenous people. So it's Arctic, Russia, Transcaucasia, Central Asia, Asia, Pacific, Africa, Latin America, and North America. And yes, during the COP23, of course, the main topic was the operationalization of the local communities and indigenous people platform, which has been very difficult to negotiate. For us, we are more used to what happened in New York and in Geneva. And when we start to work in COP22 and COP23, we see all the framework was quite hostile to indigenous people themselves, and really they have to use a lot of way to try to start a good negotiation. And the COP23, the decision to establish the local communities and indigenous people platform and how to operationalize it is a good success for them, because in the decision it's recommended that the process under the platform, including its operationalization, take into account inter alia the interest and views of local communities and indigenous people, as well as the principle proposed by indigenous people organization of full and effective participation of indigenous people, equal status of indigenous people and parties, including in leadership role, self-selection of indigenous people representative in accordance with indigenous people own procedure, and adequate funding from the Secretariat and voluntary contribution to enable the delivery of its function. So it's almost fulfill what indigenous people really want in that framework. And now the next step will be a workshop, which is going to be chaired by the chair of the SAPSTA and one representative of indigenous people selected by them. So it's really what we are looking next. What is coming in 2018? We are a little bit afraid with the COP24, because one of the strategy of indigenous people since the COP21 is to be very close of the chair, say success to establish very strong relationship with France in COP21, and it was quite a challenge because France is really not open to indigenous people issue. So we're very close to Morocco in COP23 and very close to Fiji and Germany for COP23. So we'll see what happens with Poland. It's not a state which is usually very close to indigenous people issue. But what will happen in COP24 will be crucial to know exactly how is going to work the local communities and indigenous people platform. So it's an ongoing process, and from our side, what we are going to do is to be present in 2018 to be sure that we can provide all services to all indigenous people who attend the meeting. Even internally, it's crucial to allow indigenous people to speak among themselves, to allow the different regions of the world to communicate. As the negotiation was quite tough in COP23, I can tell you that the negotiation within the indigenous people forum was also very tough between them, and they really need time, space, and technical support to find a consensus and go all together once they face the states and other stakeholders. It's what makes the strength of indigenous people at the international level since the beginning, and it's really what they want to continue to do in the UNF3 policy process, to stand all together to negotiate.
Thank you so much, David. And now we will try to get Reverend Fletcher via video message. I think my colleague Budi is going to try to set it up. It's set up.
Good morning.
Here we go.
This is Fletcher Harper with Green Faith. It's good to be with you. I hope also to be able to be with you live by video so that we can have some time for conversation. I'm here to speak to you about the fact that at COP23, along with a number of partners, including the Brahma Kumaris, the Bhumi Project, a Hindu environmental network, the Franciscan Action Network, the Global Catholic Climate Movement, the Global Muslim Climate Network, Hazon, a Jewish environmental group, One Earth Sangha, a Buddhist environmental organization, the Islamic Society for North America, the World Council of Churches, the World Evangelical Alliance, and the Unitarian Universalist Service Committee, we were really pleased to, to launch a multi-faith sustainable living initiative. The initiative is designed to address the fact that there, as part of our response to climate change, there's an absolute need for what some people refer to as a behavioral wedge, a series of carbon-reducing behaviors that, if applied at scale, can make a meaningful contribution to the absolutely necessary advocacy on the policy and financial level that many of us are undertaking. None of the IPCC scenarios or any of the serious scientific projections about how to meet the targets that we need to meet for a 1.5 or a 2 degree future take this kind of behavior change into account. And as people of faith, we think that's wrong, and we think that we have an opportunity to show that new behaviors adopted at scale can make a meaningful contribution. So what we've done so far has been to identify 3 behaviors that, when taken together, represent in most places or in many contexts the biggest contributors that individual behavior change or household behavior change can make to greenhouse gas emission levels. And those 3 behaviors are the areas of home energy use, diet, specifically moving towards a plant-based diet and reducing or eliminating food waste, and transportation, specifically within that category, reducing or eliminating car travel and minimizing air transportation. So those 3 behaviors, which we're referring to as our 3 pillars, represent the 3 behavior areas that we're going to be focusing on. We've also identified an approach to change that's based on the growing amount of social science research that's shown the ways that really, when applied properly, behavior change can be sustained over a period of time. And there are 5 different components to the approach to change that we'll be taking. The first is that we're going to be looking for, starting today, religious and spiritual leaders who are willing to publicly make and keep commitments to a sustainable lifestyle. And what that means is that we're looking for leaders who will be willing to say publicly, I'm committing to adopt a plant-based diet or to move towards adopting a plant-based diet, and then to demonstrate or model that behavior publicly. Same for the other behaviors. We're not looking for leaders who will necessarily make commitments in all 3 areas at the same time, though of course if they are called to do so, that's absolutely wonderful. But we want to be able to showcase the example of leaders walking the talk, because research shows that that makes a difference. The second thing that we want to be doing is providing opportunities for faith and spiritual communities to take part in activities through which they can try out these new behaviors. So a bike to worship weekend, a community meal which is plant-based, things like that, which enable people to try out the new behavior, realize that it's not so bad, even fun or good or meaningful, and that helps them adopt it further. And that's closely connected with the third kind of activity we'll be undertaking, which is to provide information, education about why it's important to make these behavior changes, the carbon impacts that are implied in these behavior changes, and how to do it. Cooking recipes, suggestions about how to manage activities without car or airplane transit, things like that. The fourth kind of behavior, or the fourth kind of activity that we'll be supporting, is to provide and identify narratives that different faith and spiritual communities can use that represent their own deepest values and that frame these new behaviors in terms of those values. We're working with George Marshall and the team at Climate Outreach, a well-respected climate communications consultancy in the UK, to do that, and we'll actually have some early stage narratives to share relatively soon. And finally, we'll be working on finding ways to identify upstanders, people within each of these, within different faith and spiritual communities, who want to take on these behaviors and who want to help others do the same. And we'll be finding ways to enable them to offer peer support, because again, research has shown that that's the kind of thing that helps people not only make but keep these commitments. The goal for this year is to find a way to bring together a large number of pledges, commitments towards sustainable living, and to offer those up in two formats. First, on a weekend sometime this fall, either in late September or early October, where around the world we'll have 50 to 70 high-profile events at faith and spiritual institutions where people of faith and leaders will be bringing forth these commitments. And then we hope that the same will happen on a local level at hundreds, if not thousands, of faith and spiritual centers around the world. And the second venue for these commitments is the Global Climate Action Summit taking place in California this September. We're in close communication with the organizers of that summit, and they're eager for us to offer up these commitments as a way of putting the behavioral wedge that I mentioned earlier on the table as part of our response collectively to the climate crisis. We're looking forward to working with all of you. We're absolutely thrilled to announce that someone who I believe may be in the room already, Caroline Bader, with whom many of us have worked over the years in her role at the Lutheran World Federation, is going to be joining us as the director of this initiative. She starts February 1st. We absolutely can't wait. We're so thrilled to be able to work with her on this, and we look forward to working with all of you, and I hope to be in touch more about this soon. Thanks again very much, and I hope the day is going well. Bye-bye. Good morning. This is Fletcher Harper.
So, okay, I've not had to really moderate Fletcher. I also just wanted to say that actually this session is being live streamed, and quite a few people are with us, including Fletcher is following the proceedings of this gathering via internet. Now I guess I give the floor to you, Valeriane.
Thank you, Tina, and nice to be here with all of you. It's good to speak last because so many things have been said, so it's always a privilege to gather on the knowledge that has already been provided in the panel. What I would like to say is that the faith-based organizations are very many. There are over, I remember in Lima I got the right numbers, there were over 375 people coming from different faith-based organizations. So within the COP itself, the official COP. Then if you consider that more than 80% of the planet is actually feeling they belong to a faith, it represents a lot of people. And within the COP, we have therefore such a huge paint brushes and colors, and all these different people are there. Some are very engaged with the policymakers, some are giving a hand to the negotiators, some are trying to work with energy, pushing agendas on human rights, some working on the purely ethical aspects. There was also in the COP23 over 20 religious events happening in different churches around the city. Within the different churches, Christian, Catholic, there was Muslim people doing things, Jewish people doing things. And so it's really very amazing to watch through this lens what's happening to our world. And maybe, as Isaiah was saying, to try, therefore, and I think this is why we are all here today, to gather the vision that and the voice that we want to be able to push forward within these climate change conversations. My colleague here, Henrik, and I, we have been part of the what has been called over the past 4 years the Interfaith Liaison Committee with the UNFCCC. And as such, we've been trying with Nigel and with Caroline before, and who is also a colleague from the WCC in the previous years, to try and bring to the knowledge of the UNFCCC the kind of voices and work that we do, because a lot of these organizations are very present in the time of adapting to tremendous weather and climate change impacted thing. And we have also people like Brahma Kumaris who are so focused on consciousness and awareness. For us, it is so important to understand that the human activity is primarily guided by the human awareness. And if we want to change our action, if we want to change our activity, if we want to be able to create a better world for tomorrow, we really need to call on awareness. We have participated, therefore, in the Conscience Summit that happened in Paris and in Morocco before the COPs. We also co-organized the meditation over 24 hours for the earth. So it's always topics that each one of us, through the flavor of our own spirituality, concentrate on what's happening. We've worked closely with the indigenous communities as well. We've organized meetings with the different secretaries, general secretaries of the UNFCCC to try and bring that voice, but also to try and bring the capacity of this group to make a difference. As you probably know, the faith-based organizations aren't a constituency, which gives us the possibility to be like changing color all the time and changing hats and changing work. But at the same time, it means that we kind of have to reinvent ourselves all the time. So during the COP, we held two meetings where there were many different flavors of spiritualities, where there was indicated a great need for a spiritual presence during the COPs, because many of my colleagues were saying that people, negotiators, observers are all tremendously affected emotionally also, because we are aware of what's happening to the world, because we're listening to the knowledge provided by the science, and we're not changing the channel, we're staying there, we're present. And we've noticed that fear, anguish, and anger, and people getting more and more comfortable in small-framed problems is also part of the issue. So with our colleague from CUNO, Lindsay, who many of you know very well here, we have organized events trying to focus on what it is we could say to a negotiator, and what does a negotiator can speak to his capital, if he has the opportunity to make the capital move. Because negotiators are human beings, and these people have hearts, these people have faith. And Christiana Figueres was quite clear on changing hearts. That was one of the big things she communicated, at least. She's still trying to do the same with her Mission 2020. And I think that this kind of event we are organizing here together is also to try and have a better voice for the next COP when we get there. So this time there was really the awareness also, as Fletcher was saying, of the need of showing people that even individuals can make a difference through the lifestyle they wish to follow. Because just being upset and angry because our governments don't take the right decisions is an option, but it's not very épanouissant, we say in French. It doesn't bring you lots of guts and power and happiness, but focusing also on what can be changed as individuals and bringing this awareness to the people is something that we feel we could really go on working with. So in a sense, if you look at what faith-based work on, we work on the faith with all the variety. With scientists, we work on the aspects of conscience, of ethics, of principles. With the people from the religions, we try to find common path through our belief system. With the people, we are also very focused on human rights, on the whole topic of resilience, on the whole topic of creating the right mechanisms at the political level for the world to be able to provide a safe platform for human beings to go on living. But at the level of Mother Earth also, we're looking at what kind of relationship human beings need to create with themselves in order to create a proper relationship with Mother Earth, looking at the different aspects of energy, of mitigation, of the way we choose to build, the way we choose to develop or not develop, or how we develop. All this transition has to be spoken about, and it's not. We do not see enough of the transition conversation. So I think the faith-based organization is a good window to try and bring this. But of course, we need to work with all our friends from all the different groups and organizations. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Valeriane, and thank you to everyone on the panel for speaking to this topic on debriefing COP23 from faith and ethical perspectives. I think we can probably take a few minutes from the second panel because we started quite a bit late. So I would say we could probably take one or two questions from the floor.
Skype people, if they're online, that could also speak.
And we also have some people who are following the live stream, and you're also welcome to post some questions via Skype. So, floor is open. We can, as I said, we can take a few questions from the floor. Or comments. Please. If you could go to the mic and just very briefly introduce yourself, name and organization.
Yes. I answered directly, or you take more question?
Are there any more questions? I think it might be good to collect a few before we request the panelists to respond. But So far, no questions, so I think, David, you can go ahead.
So from our side, it's quite simple as what we see from the outside world, just to provide technical services. So if you have an interpreter, if you have translator of documents, if you have any kind of capacity like that, and of course, if you have accreditation, because when we go to a conference like a COP, we need 10 badges to go in the negotiation zone because we bring 6 interpreters plus other people. So for us, it's the main issue is to really find an access in the negotiation zone, because in the public zone it's always very easy, but in the negotiation zone, as everybody know, it's quite difficult to get badges, especially when you need 10 of them. So it's all we can collaborate. And after, of course, if you would like to get in touch with International Indigenous People Forum, it's possible. Just go to them, speak with them. As Valeriane said, they are quite close to the faith-based organization. They work quite often together on different topics and issues. So it's they are totally open to collaborate.
Okay, now, Attilio from Franciscus International. Is a general question, because all the report were very full of input, and I believe they need a long reflection from us. So I ask if possible to have a printed report for each of the panelists, so we can bring home and share and go deeper and maybe raise questions after a reflection, because now the emotions from what you said are many, and I am not able now to go or select which one of the question to put to you. Thank you.
Thank you for that. So there's a plea for the panelists to please share their inputs in writing.
Manoj Kurian, coordinating the WCC Ecumenical Advocacy Alliance. So I work with Athena and Henrik. Just a comment. I really appreciate all your input, and I think it's this presentation also highlights the importance of bringing the value and the faith and spirituality. It doesn't mean that we work in isolation, but really across the board. So it was quite impressive to hear all your input, and it's very clear that as faith communities we have to work with all technical and with all the organizations and with the United Nations and civil society. Especially quite impressed with also how the language, and when I work on food issues, and we find that this is one of the biggest stumbling blocks in many situations when we bring in many of our negotiations, whether it is CFS and all these UN levels, there's huge cuts of resources, and people are just left out from these discussions. So that is very helpful. And then I think it's also very clear that we need to go back to the deeper values. And I look forward to hearing more from all of you on those lines, because in these negotiations, it is quite shocking to see how flagrantly people are giving up their commitments. So how do we hold ourselves and many of our governments and ourselves also accountable to these? And I think it's up to us to lift up these fundamental values of human dignity and respecting the environment and Mother Earth and each other. But thank you very much.
Is there anyone from the panel who would like to speak a bit more to Manoj's question? Oh, okay. Please go ahead.
Okay.
I wanted to avoid this. Thank you for that presentation. It was very interesting. I am Natalia. I work in the mission of Bolivia. I was part of a negotiating team during the COP, but I'm now working on human rights issues. And I'm particularly also interested in equity matters, specifically related to Article 6 that were mentioned here briefly. So my question was, if you could comment a little bit more, what are your thoughts on the potential equity or ethical aspects of markets, which I think it's an area that could also provide a lot of discussions. And also another question I had was whether your organizations had also worked on the issue of the participation of companies during the negotiations. I understand that at least in COP21 there was a discussion on whether that should be allowed or not, because actually there's a conflict of interest on the transnational corporations, particularly, like, for example, oil producers and so forth, to participate within the discussions. So I don't know if you had been able to follow up on that. And can I also, one final question on the first panelist, no, the second panelist, sorry, mentioned about how the claims, how the human rights concepts that have been introduced into the preambular part could be used to make claims by people in at the national level and so forth. So I wanted to hear how is the office working on that possibility and all the different committees here in the human rights treaty bodies. Thank you.
Thank you for that question. I think that will be the last question, and now I would like a request the panelists to perhaps, there was a direct question to Ben, but if the other panelists would also want to comment on the questions posed, please feel free to do so. But perhaps we ask Ben to start.
Thank you. So a couple of points I wanted to address. One, regarding this idea of deeper values, I think for some people that's certainly faith. For others, it's an international human rights framework, or in some ways the international human rights framework encompasses a lot of elements of deeper values that are expressed by different faiths. The idea of human dignity, respect for human rights, etc. And so I think that is really important, and it's something that needs to happen at the negotiations. So that's what struck a chord with me about the comment, is that a lot of the work that needs to be done is bringing real people with real incentives, real experience, real passion to the discussions, and bringing their stories and sharing them. And that's something that'll be very interesting to talk about in the context of the Talanoa dialogue and the conversation coming up. There were a few questions posed related to human rights litigation, treaty bodies, participation of companies, etc. I don't know that I can address all of them very well right now. The litigation is ongoing, and it's not actually, I mean, it's not necessarily directly related to the inclusion of human rights language in the preamble of the Paris Agreement. This started before the Paris Agreement. It's going to continue after. And what's interesting is to see that we have both now a legal hook in the context of the preamble of the Paris Agreement for sort of UNFCCC processes, and to further the argument that, look, this is a known and recognized relationship between human rights and climate change. But we also have a hook in the context of the now annual Human Rights Council resolution on climate change. And we also have these different cases which have been ongoing, not just on climate change explicitly, but on other forms of environmental harm too. So there are these different ways that you can build arguments and cases at a national level, and certainly it helps to have human rights language in the Paris Agreement as well. We are not directly engaged right now on this subject, human rights litigation. I'm the only person in the office working on climate change and environment, and so we have a limited capacity. But it's something we're looking at very closely, and I actually hope we'll start working on this year, and it really just depends on whether or not I'm able to get it done. So human rights treaty bodies are doing more and more work. We've worked a lot with the Geneva Climate Change Consultative Group on this subject, and particularly with a few of the people here in the room in terms of trying to get them to engage more deeply with climate change and environmental issues. And as I mentioned in my earlier remarks, CEDA is planning to issue a general recommendation on climate change and disaster risk reduction. But other treaty bodies have been engaging with these issues as well, including CRC, which held a day of general discussion on environment, and CESC, which continues to look at these issues and issue some observations, etc., in that context. I think I should stop there. I'm sorry if I wasn't able to touch upon everything, but I know we have more panels to come.
Thank you. Just to respond to a couple of the questions, I think the one on equity is a really important one, because we had a side event together with the government of Switzerland at COP23 to look at what equity looks like in the implementation of the Paris Agreement. And as you will recall, the Paris Agreement sort of got rid of the firewall between what used to be Annex 1 and non-Annex 1 countries. Meanwhile, it has to be implemented in the context of the CBDR, Common but Differentiated Responsibility principle from the convention. And then taking sort of an understanding of the world having changed from 1992 to what it is right now. However, I think there seems to be some kind of a desire to look at the world as the same right now, and so sort of not necessarily emphasizing quite strongly that there are responsibilities that certain countries have to take based on their historical responsibility for causing climate change, but also their capabilities or capacity to do something about it. And so I would say that equity will become quite important in the context of the Paris Rulebook. I guess also from a human rights perspective, it would be quite interesting to see how we can entrench equity in the guidelines for implementing the agreement, so that the most vulnerable, those that are affected the most, still get the required support, and those that are more responsible and more committed, the USA, for example, needs to recognize that it is not charity. Climate action is based very much on human rights. It's based on more than just the goodwill of the hearts of people that are willing to help. So that's something important to say. I think on the question around companies and their participation, it came quite strongly last year. I think, and in the substance, I think as well, the intersessional as well. And I was just looking through some of the documentation around this, the whole arrangement for intergovernmental meetings, and what our perspectives have been. I think with the rest of the panel, at least in WCC and LWF, we haven't really taken a position on that. We haven't at least expressed a position whether we want or we do not want private companies to participate. But it is important to note that there have been many companies participating in the negotiations with the aim of derailing them. We saw that in Copenhagen quite openly. Some incredible fossil fuel industry showing up just for the purpose of destroying things. However, there are also many, many companies right now in the private sector that are sort of changing their ways and starting to be part of the solutions. And so I think we need to have an internal reflection and a conversation whether there are private sector actors that could contribute to climate justice and to progress, and whether there are companies that need to be named and shamed, or possibly named and excused from a table or a platform that is supposed to be solving climate change. My last comment, Athena, is very much related to what my brother from EAA, whose name Manoj spoke about. I think our role moving forward, and it also echoes very much what Valeriane said, we need to recognize strongly that our role as bridges, first to build where where bridges don't exist. Increasingly, you will see that the tension, and COP23 was a very difficult negotiation. Developing countries had such a hard time. It felt like we were fighting. I negotiate for my country and Kenya, and I sit within the G77 negotiation. It was extremely difficult. It was hard to get anything moving. And so we need to start to think about how do we build these bridges? How do we restore confidence so that we're seeing each other as people of the same community trying to solve a big problem? And so I would be very interested to look at that, to build bridges, but also to serve as a bridge where, for example, none exists. And then maybe also the concept of mending bridges where there were some but have been wounded or hurt for some reason or the other. And I think it is a really, really unique role that we can play as faith-based organizations. And opportunities to do that are in the Talanoa dialogue. They are in the expert dialogue on loss and damage support. And they are also in the other spaces for negotiation that are happening this year. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And now some very short final words from David and also Valeriane.
Yes, I just would like to come back very quickly on the deeper values and also are needed in such framework of negotiation. For indigenous people, it's not even a question that you must link your negotiation with a strong value of life. Just to give you a very practical example, when they organize themselves a meeting, especially when it's with officials, say, always open it and close it with a traditional prayer, because for them you must really set a good framework of negotiation, and starting and closing with spirituality. It's essential for that, and also to link it with culture. So it's always a demonstration, like a song or a dance or whatever. It's the holistic approach of indigenous people. You cannot split what you do in the UN or your life on a daily basis. What is your spirituality, and more important, or you connect to other earth. And I always remind something. When you are in a COP meeting, you are try to do nice things like the bottle of water and things like that. And indigenous people always laugh at that, because say, do you really think you are going to change the climate change because you use that kind of bottle? The key issue is to get connected to the earth and to respect it. And as soon as Western people are not in that mind, we won't solve the climate change. And it's really a key message for them. We really need to go back to traditional value and to re-establish a link with Mother Earth.
Well, thanks for engaging. I think that we, as faith-based organizations, we're not specialists in technology, nor in politics, nor in economy, but we definitely are very involved with the whole topic of ethics and values. So whether we want to look at technology, we do not want the kind of technology that's going to destroy the planet even more. So we need to engage with a concept, a principle regarding technology. And like the Brahma Kumaris, we've engaged with solar systems in such a way that our university is an example for all India. And so we need to walk the talk, but we need to provide also the platform for these discussions around development, around technology. And these values that are traditional, they're also the human rights values, they're also the cultural values, they're also the traditional ones. So I think that as a human being, we cannot put our names on something like water or on the light of the sun. In the same way, we cannot write the name of a religion on any of these values. They're human, they belong to all of us. So I do think we need to think regarding, for me, the word transition is a good word because it shows that we want to go towards the future. Now, which future do we want? And we need to have a vision. We do not wish to have the less possible terrible future. I mean, I don't want that. I want the best future. And if we do not keep a aim, if we don't keep a vision, if we don't keep, we won't create it. So it's in our hands to drive these conversations. And thank you very much.
Thank you. And can I have a round of applause for our wonderful panelists? We now move on to the second panel. I guess, Budi, and sorry for taking some of your time.
So good morning, everyone. And thank you very much, Athena, for bringing the first part of the discussion interesting, in which we had a good input coming from the panelists on COP23, in which it was an effort really try to bring Paris Agreement into something that is doable, tangible, although the challenge is still spread ahead of us, in which the COP24 will be very key COP in which certain decisions will be taken, and that will be the modality on how the Paris Agreement will be implemented. And the second part basically is focusing on how we will try to move forward together, try to see how we will deal with the COP24. One of the takeaway that was quite interesting from COP23 was the fact that Fiji has launched what we call as Talanoa dialogue. In fact, we've been in touch with the Fiji mission until the last minute and tried to bring the Fiji mission to our discussion. And unfortunately, the two key important persons from the Fiji missions are now in Bonn to precisely discuss about this Talanoa dialogue with the UNFCCC Secretariat. For that, we will not have in person the Fiji delegation, but we have a specific message that was sent this morning from the Fiji mission, in which it will explain about the Talanoa dialogue. And apart from the Fiji mission, we will have three distinguished speakers who will share their views on how to move forward toward the COP24 from different perspectives, We will have Chiara from CITSE, who is a faith-based organizations and has been involved a lot on this issue of climate change and in negotiation and UNFCCC. And then we will have Yves Lador, who is one of the key person in terms of human rights approach to toward climate negotiations, and he will explain about the work of the human rights organizations and his own organizations on how to push forward the issue of human rights within these climate change negotiations. And we will also have the Reverend Hendrik Grappe from the World Council of Churches, who's been representing WCC in I don't know how many COP negotiations, and he is one of the key experts from the WCC in terms of bringing the views of the churches within the negotiations. So before we start with the three panelists, I would like to invite Valeriane, who might not be in the room at the moment, to read the message from Fiji mission. But in any case, since Valeriane is not in the room, I will read this message that we received this morning from Suva. So it's fresh from Suva, from Fiji, regarding the Talanoa dialogue. So I will read it, and I have copies of the message for the participants here. Call for participation in the Talanoa dialogue and multi-faith charter. Religion and religious institutions play an integral and vital role in the lives of the majority of the world's population. Religions often a source of moral guidance among people who currently live in areas that are affected by climate change. Religious leaders can offer invaluable supports and access to help mobilize responses. They work face to face on a personal level in their local communities, and they are trusted and respected in areas where the local populations might not immediately cooperate with other groups. Interfaith cooperation is particularly important in Fiji, which is a multi-religious country where religious communities live side by side in the spirit of mutual respect and cooperation. In 2018, together with the incoming Polish COP24 presidency, we'll convene a facilitative dialogue known as the Talanoa dialogue among parties to take stock of the collective efforts of parties in relation to progress toward the long-term goal referred to in Article 4, Paragraph 1 of the Paris Agreement, and to inform the preparations of nationally determined contributions pursuant to Article 4, Paragraph 8 of the Agreement. During the preparatory phase of the Talanoa dialogue, there will be an opportunity for parties, stakeholders, and expert institutions to provide inputs that will inform the dialogue. In this regard, we encourage the Interfaith Liaison Committee within the UNFCCC to help collect, synthesize, and submit inputs from its wider group organizations, networks, and allies. On Talanoa dialogue, while the specific methodology of the dialogue is still being finalized, an informal note was issued at COP23 by the presidencies of COP22 and COP23 that provided an overview of the approach to this year-long process. Based on input received by parties, the main features of the dialogue are as follows. The dialogue should be constructive, facilitative, and solution-oriented. The dialogue should not lead to discussions of confrontational nature in which individual parties or groups of parties are singled out. The dialogue will be conducted in the spirit of the Pacific traditions of Talanoa, in which Talanoa is a traditional approach used in Fiji and the Pacific to engage in inclusive, participatory, and transparent dialogue. The purpose of Talanoa is to share stories, build empathy, and trust. During the process, participants advance their knowledge through common understanding. It creates a platform of dialogue, which results in better decision-making for the collective good. By focusing on the benefits of collective action, this process will inform decision-making and move the global climate agenda forward. The dialogue should be conducted in a manner that promotes cooperation. The dialogue will be conducted in a manner that promotes enhanced ambition. The dialogue will consider, as one of its elements, the efforts of parties on action and support, as appropriate, in the pre-2020 period. The dialogue will fulfill its mandate in a comprehensive and non-restrictive manner. The dialogue will consist of a preparatory and a political phase. The presidencies of COP23 and COP24 will jointly lead both phases of the dialogue and co-chair the political phase at COP24, and a dedicated space will be provided in the dialogue, both during the preparatory and the political phase, to facilitate the understanding of the implications of the special report by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change on Global Warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius. The dialogue will structure around 3 general topics. First, where we are. Second, where do we want to go? And third, how do we get there? Parties, stakeholders, and expert institutions are encouraged to prepare analytical and policy-relevant inputs to inform the dialogue and submit these and other proposed inputs, including those from intergovernmental organizations and UNFCCC bodies, by 2nd of April 2018 for discussion in conjunction with the May session, and by 29 October 2018 for discussion in conjunction with COP24. An online platform will soon be launched to facilitate the submissions of and access to all inputs to the dialogue, which will be overseen by the presidencies of COP23 and COP24. More information on the dialogue can be found at the specific website of COP23 of Fiji. COP23 Multi-Faith Charter. The COP23 Presidency Secretariat brought together different faith communities and leaders in Fiji to produce the Multi-Faith Charter in 2017. The Charter outlines the commitment of faith-based organizations to help address the effects of climate change within their own faith communities, as well as make specific calls for the increased ambition and action by parties and non-state actors. So far, over 100 individuals from all over the world and from diverse faith groups have signed on to the Charter. Individuals of all faiths are encouraged to sign on to the Charter so their names can be counted among eminent religious, spiritual, indigenous, and faith-based climate change leaders at COP23 and throughout Fiji's COP23 presidency. Join the COP23 Presidency Secretariat in expressing deep concern over the threat of climate change to our Earth and working toward leaving a healthy planet to our children and all future generations. The Charter can be viewed and endorsed in a specific website provided here. So that's the message from Fiji. And I would like now to invite, first of all, Iflador to provide your response and inputs as well.
Well, thank you very much, Budi, for this introduction and for reading this statement from the Fiji. Perhaps starting and launching this discussion on the Talanoa dialogue, I think it's interesting to see a bit where does the Talanoa dialogue fit? Where does it fit into? And I'd like to start with what Isaiah said really at the beginning of the discussion, expressing the usual doubts and usually mixed feelings you have when you get out of a COP. And I think it's a very valuable comment he made, and an important one, because we always have this feeling and we're always living with this feeling each time we work on these issues. But very first, I think we have to keep in mind that today when we see the situation, it's not only in climate change that we have this feeling. When you work in any other issue, human rights, development, trade, or whatever, you always get out with this feeling, well, we're very far from delivering. And I think we have to face that today. No real process is really delivering. We see that for the states, and actually it's in the field of climate change that we have the most recent success, perhaps also on some of the, I'm thinking of small arms trades, treaties and things like that, but there's very few fields where you can build on a recent success of a multilateral negotiation. And even at the regional level, we haven't seen recently any striking progress. So I think we have to face that it's a much more general picture where we have these type of problems. And actually climate change is the field where in Paris there has been, it was possible to reach a multilateral agreement which sets down a number of procedures and mechanisms on which we can work collectively. So I think it's very first picture that we have to have in mind in order to evaluate how we should feel, good or bad, because it is true it's not delivering. The whole system is not delivering, but we're not delivering at the national level. We're not delivering at the local level either, as we should. The industry are not delivering, and it's interesting, I forgot the reference, to take the reference with me, but there is a recent study made by a group of business and big business who were actually showing that about 70% of the main international major companies, transnational corporations, so on, do not have any plan on sustainable development. Just starting as that, of course, you can just forget about climate change. Which really means when we hear, because we hear now even within the UN, which is pretty worrying, some prominent people saying, oh, the solution will come from business. That's just not true at all. I mean, the business itself, big business, recognizes that 70% of the companies do not take this seriously enough to have it in their strategies. And those who have, we know that for an important percentage, but that would be much more difficult to say which percentage, those who do have something, part of it is just greenwashing. So what is left to be really genuine is not much. And of course, and I agree with what Isia said, there is a discussion that we should have in order that those who do take these issues seriously are put it in front and are people with whom we should be talking more. But it again shows that whatever the field you look at, we are, all of us collectively speaking, not delivering. So it's in this framework that we have to see that some of the progress that has been made are interesting, and what came out of COP23, which has been presented just before, are very interesting and positive steps because they are in one of the process which is providing more, or at least delivering a bit more than other processes. I think it shows also that the debate on these issues, being so crucial, needs to be widened up and not just only limited to the UNFCCC. One of the problems is that a lot of our energy, even within the civil society, is taken up by, remember that in a recent debate, someone was criticizing these type of approach, saying that we're just polishing the institution, making them always better. And I like this image that it's true, we're spending, and I particularly feel concerned by that, we're spending our time polishing the institutions, increasing the efficiency of the mechanisms and so on. And this is needed. But it is true that the debate must be also put at a higher level, and that's where we probably here have a lot to do, and I think the faith-based groups have a lot to bring in this type of discussion. And this is why also making a link, for example, and that's the field in which I'm active, and it's just one of the elements. I don't want to put it as the element, but it's, I think, an important element. When you're trying to link human rights and climate change, we are precisely trying not to be only focused in one type of forum, in one type of dialogue, but to put the discussion at a higher level and to see how the different existing mechanisms can contribute to the success on each side, and also what is a type of narrative, what is a type of debate which goes with it. Because it's not only just an institutional issue, it's a wider issue. And I think this is an important issue. And that's why we're very happy to be working in the framework of the GECO in Geneva, which is the Geneva Climate Change Consultative Group, where many of your organizations, faith-based groups, were very happy to be here at the World Council of Churches, because the World Council of Churches has been a very prominent actor in the development of GECO, and participating for a long time in all of the development of these different activities. But we have also non-faith, and very important non-faith and human rights organization, classical human rights organization like Human Rights Watch, participating in this setup. So it's an important and very interesting dialogue. When we're doing this, we're trying to work on both sides, and it should be said that there are two groups of organizations. Some of them are the same, and the two groupings have the same organizations, but they don't totally overlap. Those who are directly following the climate change negotiations is the Working Group on Human Rights and Climate Change, and they're bringing more of these human rights issues inside the climate change negotiation. And here in Geneva with the GECO, we're doing the other way around. We're going the other way around. We are bringing more of the climate change issues in the human rights discussion. And for example, to be very concrete, I have the very honored privilege to be showing here one of the very few examples of a document which basically will be issued next week, from what I understand, which has been produced by CIEL, the Center for International Environmental Law, and the Global Initiative for Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which is a small manual in a way, or a small indication on how you can follow human rights obligation in the state's human rights obligation in the context of climate change with the human rights treaty bodies. This is really aimed for the human rights treaty bodies. It has been mentioned by Ben before. It's been mentioned also by others. Human rights treaty bodies are taking up this issue more and more. And you don't only have the, which Ben has mentioned, the general commentary, which are being developed by different treaty bodies, but that does take some time. Of course, it helps a lot because it gives the jurisprudence and the link between fundamental rights and climate change issues. But you also have all of the periodic reports. And for example, this afternoon, and that's why I know some of the people in the room had to leave. You will have a discussion at the the Committee on the Right of the Child on climate change and environmental issues, precisely looking at how they can deal with that when they're reviewing state reports. So you see, these type of very practical work is going on. But of course, we sometimes have this trend to see things going into direction and trying to make the links. And it's not very always very easy to do such a link. But as Woody said, for next year, there will be very important targets. And there are 3 targets. I'm going to finish on that. One of the targets relates to what David has presented and what was presented also. There is also, we didn't talk that much about the Gender Action Program, which is one of the big success of the COP23. What is interesting is that these type of success are introducing very specific and concerned constituencies in the general discussion of the UNFCCC. Let's not forget, UNFCCC, it's the General Framework Convention, which meets every year, in which we have the Paris negotiation and so on. But very often, people just focus on the Paris Agreement, on the Paris Accord, and forget that this is just one element in a wider framework. And what has been presented before are very important success of specific constituencies having a foot now in the general dialogue, in the different mechanisms. And we do hope that in the coming years, this will make a change on these type of issues, for at least for indigenous people and for women, for women's rights. There are also some progress, because that has been mentioned this morning by someone, on the question of food security or food issues, which has also made very small progress, but we hope that they will have an impact in the coming years. So that's one of the track we're going to have to follow during this year. The second track is, of course, the end of the negotiation of the implementation mechanism of the Paris Agreement. We heard a lot in the media criticism of saying, well, there was COP21, and why do we have a COP23 and it's not producing anything like what happened in Paris? Well, of course, that was unfortunately quite stupid comment and not very helpful at all. It's a wrong analysis. What happened in Paris was the adoption of an important agreement, but now we had to discuss how do we implement it once we've agreed on the basic elements. And the whole mechanism is basically that the countries make their own national commitments, because when you go a top-down, which was the Kyoto Protocol approach, it didn't succeed. It was a very logical and a very obvious way to proceed, but it didn't succeed. At least that's what the countries agreed on in Copenhagen. They failed, let's say. So they decided to follow another procedure, which was agreed in Paris, that it goes from the bottom up. So now we have this mechanism, and it has to be implemented correctly. And that's where we do have, that was mentioned in one of the questions this morning, actually by the mission of Bolivia, and it's a very important one. It's how do we implement, how do we make sure that all of the basic human rights principles, but which are wide, it also concerns food security, ecosystem integrity, and these issues that we have in the preamble, and that was the success in Paris. How we make sure that this, which is in the preamble, will be now reflected in the mechanisms that will implement the Paris Agreement. We're not there yet. Actually, it's only in COP23 that we've been able to see what is the general frame of what could become this implementation mechanism and the so-called rule book, although now it's always changing its name, so I don't know what is the last name they're using, and to see how the principles in the preamble will be implemented. It's unfortunately an illustration of what we were unable to reach in Paris. It's to have these principle in Article 2, which is the very general operative part of the agreement, because if we had that, we would not be striving right now, and what will happen at the end of the year, to have a reflection of these preambles in the mechanism, because it would be automatic. You would have that, and unfortunately, and I'm still pretty mad with some of the countries who refused to do to promote this in Article 2, because some of the countries could have helped to do a much better job for that, including some of our countries. And it's quite unfortunate, because that's what we're going to have to struggle for in Paris. And it's very important. We will need all the forces to work on that. Then what is the third element is precisely this Talanoa dialogue. Where does it fit into that? Well, it doesn't fit in these two elements that I've just been presenting. It's a dialogue which is on the side of this political process. Why is it on the side? Because the Talanoa dialogue is a request that was agreed in Paris. And the idea is precisely to look at the gap that is coming out of the individual commitments and what is needed to achieve the goals of Paris, which is to have something way below 2 degrees, that is at least below 1.5 degrees. And there is a human rights aspect in that. Why 1.5? It's because the higher you have an increase of the global warming, the more people will see their very, very basic rights being violated in different ways, directly from the climate or through climate actions or climate measures and so on. So here there is clearly an issue. So the Talanoa dialogue is a very important legacy that we have and that we will carry over the coming years from the Fiji presidency. Because what they have brought in this dialogue was everybody was wondering, how are we going to do this dialogue? Because this is a very, very hot potato. Because it's pointing to we're not making it. So it is a very, very hot potato. And everybody was wondering, how will this dialogue happen? Because there was a principle, yes, of course, we should discuss about it. And in Paris, everybody agreed because, well, we'll see later how to do it. Well, now we are a bit later, and we're going to have to do this dialogue. And how would we do this? Well, the Fiji presidency is bringing this as a methodology coming from a type of dialogue that is very well known in the Pacific Islands. It's brought by the Fijis. Probably you might have other type of names in other islands, but it's the same type of procedure coming from the traditional cultures, from the indigenous cultures of the Pacific, where when you have a hot issue, there's a way to discuss it, where you are inclusive. You bring everybody around the table. And you try to discuss in a way that you don't insult the others, which would just make any dialogue impossible. So that's the challenge we have in front of us. It's on the side of these political discussions we're going to have at the end of the year on implementing the Paris Agreement. We have also to find a methodology in order to discuss about how do we deal now with all of the people concerned with the fact that we're not reaching. I mean, when you add all of the individual commitments, we are not reaching the target of 2 degrees and even less for 1.5, which means that, in a way, we are agreeing that a number of people should be sacrificed. Now, if we say this, who are the people who are going to be sacrificed? What are their rights? What is the legitimacy of those who decide that others should be sacrificed? I mean, it's just the whole basic rules of the international order we're living on under, which is being challenged. So it's not a small issue, it is a very big one. And it's a privilege to see that the Fijis are bringing this very, very important methodology. I mean, this very important proposal of a methodology, and we'll have to see if it works. We don't know. But that's why I think all of us, and that's why I do think that the faith-based groups have a lot to bring in this discussion, because you all know here how strong faith issues can become a disaster if they're not well handled and just fuel into more conflicts. Well, the Talanoa dialogue is precisely trying to propose a way to discuss of these issues without putting the reality under the carpet, not lying to each other, but still trying to have a constructive dialogue on this. And to finish, I hope that also we will be in the field of human rights to import some of these methodologies precisely to discuss about the human rights impact of the fact that we're not reaching the gap. And this is something that we probably also, that is not for this year, but for the following years, after we have a success in the Talanoa dialogue, because we're looking forward to have a successful Talanoa dialogue on these issues in 2018, to continue the dialogue in the different areas. And perhaps that's one of the ways to try to overcome some of the shortcomings we're always facing in this debate. Thank you.
Thank you very much for a very comprehensive overview on not only the Talanoa dialogue, but also on other elements in which the human right is one of the key issues that we really need to keep in mind in the implementations of Paris Agreement. Now we come to Chiara from CITSE, and who's been working a lot with different network in many continents, especially from the Catholic perspective. So you're welcome to share your views.
Okay, thanks a lot for inviting me, and thanks to all of you to be here. By listening to you, because I'm very happy with what you mentioned, especially about the heritage that we will have with the Talanoa dialogue from the Fiji presidency. And you made me think that in the run-up to COP23, in the office in CITSE, when we were thinking about how we can prepare our work towards COP23 and already looking forward to COP24, we kind of came out with a motto. And we were saying, if we leave it to people, it will be too little. If we leave it only to policy, it will be too late. So I hope you agree. And for me, I think this is a little bit how I try to summarize in my head, like what's the Talanoa dialogue means to us and to our actions and to guide our strategy to bring about climate justice. And we reflected a little bit with some of our partners after COP23 and also during the days in Bonn with some of you also there, because there was a lot about this Talanoa spirit we were saying actually in Bonn. Then it became the Talanoa dialogue. So we were reflecting a little bit on what does it mean to us, what does it mean to the CITSE network. And we said that maybe beyond the fact that of course we will have some, we will need to have some reflections on how to make it happen, on the processes to put in place, on the spaces to create, let's say, more institution and detailed and technical discussion on how to make it happen. Beyond all of that, we said to summarize, maybe we need just to think about the Talanoa dialogue as a kind of a key tool that we want to work with in promoting the implementation of the Paris Agreement. And why, in a way, we welcome such an instrument, such a tool. I wanted to summarize it in 3 points. One, because as Yves also mentioned, symbolically, I think it's very, very important in a very sterile, often environment as the negotiations are and can be very technical, very detailed negotiations. I think symbolically, speaking about Talanoa dialogue is very important because it's inspired by a tradition, is inspired by an experience, a concrete experience of how people are trying to implement dialogue, how people are trying to find compromises, how people are trying to find common solutions. So, and also I wanted to highlight that I think it's symbolically very important is coming from the Fiji experience and the Pacific area experience, but also it's something we have, let's say the Fiji tradition has in common with a lot of other indigenous traditions all around the world. And as we mentioned also in the document that the Fiji president shared with us, it brings immediately to an inclusive, participatory, transparent way of running a dialogue. And I think also important in the context of the UNFCCC negotiations, a dialogue that is based on each one counts, and there is no a kind of different power game dynamic. The second reason why we like it is is because it's about a methodology. And what I like on the description also of the presidency is that they speak about starting from share stories. So also sharing, I think, experiences by affected communities, but also positive stories and solutions and alternatives we can promote. Then you build an empathy. And I think that speaks a lot to us as faith-based organization. And only afterwards you make decisions and you make recommendations. So I think this is for me very, very interesting, and I think very hard to bring into the negotiators' rooms. And third, as Sitze, you know that we were very much inspired in 2015 by the encyclical Laudato Si of Pope Francis. I think to me the Talanoa dialogue reminds a lot about the encyclical, what the Laudato Si is telling us, because I often like to summarize that Laudato Si is simply a call to dialogue. And not only, I mean, for two reasons. A, because of the way the Laudato Si encyclical has been written in a participatory way and with the contribution of local churches from all around the world. And second, because of the call that is bringing to all of us, not only Catholic people, but all the people on this planet, to find a new way to be more creative as well. We can find a solution to move towards a more just and sustainable world. So in that regard, I just wanted to read you one quote of the Laudato Si, where the Pope is saying, "I urgently appeal for a new dialogue about how we are shaping the future for our planet. We need a conversation which includes everyone, since the environmental challenge we are undergoing concern and affect all of us." So I think that for me, in a way, is confirming what I was inspired by in 2015. I think the Talanoa dialogue is giving me in my action some other tools, another tool to bring about it. Then one important point that we also reflected on in the Sitze network is that we would like to see more clearly that the Talanoa dialogue has as main objective to reach increased mitigation targets by 2020. I think we needed to help the Talanoa dialogue to become concrete, to become a concrete instrument, and I see two important points on that. The Talanoa dialogue should seriously take into account the scale of the problem and the sense of urgency. Because I still feel, yes, it's true, Sitze is working on climate justice since a lot of years, more than 10. I'm joined Sitze later, but I still feel that both the sense of urgency and the scale of action, the scale of the problem are not well reflected when we are around the tables of the negotiations. I think all of us can say a lot about it, especially in our work we do closer in different regions of the world where the consequences of climate change are more visible, but more and more also in our own countries. If you only think, I think somebody mentioned all the issue of agriculture and climate, if you think to local farmers, also in our European countries, I think we all see how the sense of urgency is not well reflected in what we listen often from UNFCCC negotiation. And I think what also is our responsibility as especially as development and social justice organization, when we speak about urgency, is to keep also precising that when we speak about urgency, we also wanted to highlight that urgent action will differ between the degree of the urgent action will differ between countries, because economies, societies, and poverty eradication requirements differ in the regions of the world. But we have the Paris Agreement, and the Paris Agreement is based on national commitment, national plans, but with the ambition that the addition of all these national commitments should reach global target and should be able to deliver. And then on the scale of the problem, I think we, has been said already several times, also in the session before, how like also what is said in the Paris Agreement of this effort to remain below the 2 degrees and as much as closer as possible to the 1.5 actually has been translated so far in insufficient pathways. So I think this is our responsibility to keep reminding that. Then I think, again, as has been said already, we have a particular role to play as non-state actors in the dialogue, in the Talanoa dialogue. And also to emphasize, I think, that governments alone, we have a lot of evidence of that, cannot deliver. We saw it, and we just said we don't have any time anymore to waste. So as CITSE, I think together with different allies, both from the faith-based organization, but also in the wider climate movement, we believe that there are several ways on how we can play a role on the Talanoa dialogue. For example, in strengthening regional cooperation and across sectors, so environmental, faith-based, development organizations, especially at the regional level. We need to come more often together. We need to learn more from best practices. We need to give visibility, a space to testimonies and to solutions that actually are already in place. I was very much impressed in Bonn in one of our workshop where we create a kind of marketplace to bring different stories of alternatives, we said, of sustainable consumption and production partners for food. Actually, a woman from India said, what you call here alternatives actually is the way of most of the people live in the world. So stop to say alternatives. Stop to say the behavioral change or alternatives are small things. Actually, what we ask people are big shifts, are big things. So we also need to change a little bit the way we speak and the narrative we use when we speak about those things. And then I think two other important roles we have to play as non-state actors in the dialogue is to continue a reflection on which are the barriers and the big players that block the implement of real solution, and to keep denouncing false solutions. I think it has just been mentioned also all the greenwashing show we often need to be testimony of when we go to COPs or to big fora or to big summit. I think it is our role that we are closer to grassroots organizations to keep denouncing what is sold as a solution for climate justice, but we know very well that is not. Then my last point regarding the Talanoa dialogue, I think that we, in general, we have a role to play and we want to play this role to raise ambitions of the parties. So that's why we are engaged in such discussions. That's why we spend 2 weeks often in nice or less nice countries. I guess nobody is so much waiting to go 2 weeks in December in Poland. But I think we have this role to play. One point for me is to not stop to keep asking for climate justice. I think after Paris, we kind of saw a little bit of moment of fatigue of civil society, not as big as the one after Copenhagen, but still, I think we need to keep asking for climate justice, to keep the pressure, and it is our role. I mean, as you are doing today here in organizing this meeting, it is our role to keep climate justice in the global and the local agendas, especially when in some of our countries there are other issues that actually are so much interlinked, interconnected to climate justice, but that are taking over, and people are not speaking anymore about climate justice. Then, I mean, and that's the reason why I'm here. I believe that it's time for collective action. It's time, I think, the interfaith community, as well as the wider climate movement, did a lot of progress in working more together, but still there are a lot of improvements to be made. And only together, I think we can bring our voice a little bit louder. And I like to phrase, let's say, collective action for what? I think we have a lot from the Paris Agreement and all the discussion we had in the last 3 years to say we want to act together for a just transition. I think for us here in this room, this is key. And for me, it's also what the encyclical Laudato Si is saying to us when the Pope speaks about an ecological conversion. And I think this is something that speaks to a lot of faiths, to all of faiths and non-faiths, because it's, for me, the just transition, it's something that should happen at different levels, should happen in the personal life, in each of us, should happen at a collective level, in the family you live in the office you organize, but also at national and international level. And what Pope Francis is saying when he's explaining about the ecological conversion, and I like to remind me, is an ecological conversion towards a system where people and the planet come first. Then I think we said already we have a responsibility to make the most we can to bring stories of affected communities to the table of the negotiators, but also to the general public, especially in our European and Western countries. And then I just wanted to spend 1 minute more on the first, I think, role we needed to play, because I also refer to what Father Fletcher was saying earlier. I think we needed to commit more to lead by example. And this, I think, is a special role we have as faith-based community. I believe that there are a lot of studies from sociologists, you say, saying like this is the most effective way to bring about change is the example. So I think we need to invest more on that with our constituencies, with our own organizations, and in the dialogue with other actors through the adoption and promotion of a more sustainable way of living. What does it mean? I mean, I think now it's also a little bit fashion to speak about sustainable living. So I think we need to be careful in defining it more and more, in being concrete when we speak about sustainable living. And for me, it's as the 2 main drivers. One is a higher commitment to address overconsumption. And I think as faith-based organization, we have a special role to say, because we have been trained for years that progress is equal to more, is equal to more technology, more economy, more production, more consumption. And it's very hard in the campaign work we do to speak about enough, to speak about less. And I think we have compared to our other civil society organization, as faith-based organization, we have some special tools to play with that. It's a lot in our tradition, in all the faith tradition, this language of the caring, the language of the sharing. So I really think that we needed to stress this commitment to address overconsumption. And then for me, the other driver on speaking about sustainable living remains social justice. Because the experiences of people who live every day, the consequences of the growth obsession of rich and Western European and North American societies strongly reminds us on how unsustainable consumption and production patterns contribute to unfair share of resources, to human rights violation, and to nature degradation. So I think that should be our driver in living, in calling for sustainable living. And I wanted to quote a woman from the Philippines that was part of one discussion we had in Bonn on sustainable living. And she concluded by saying, the worst thing we can do is to remain passive. I think I don't have much time anymore. 2 minutes? 1 minute. So just to, because Budi asked me in the email to say, so how CITSE is preparing towards COP24. So maybe I show you this. I don't know if you can see that. It's a kind of house with the 3 pillars. So it's a little bit the way we are trying to work in the run-up to COP since already 2014. Because some of you might know CITSE since a long while. We are mainly an advocacy office. We were mainly engaged in UNFCCC negotiations from a policy and a technical point of view. But in our rethinking our strategy, we realized, not a big surprise, that we were not so successful. And actually the change we were bringing, it's so little. So we had a lot of discussions, and we also passed through a lot of frustrations. But we see today our strategy towards big events such the COP being more a kind of inside-outside strategy. So to not focus our energy only on one part, but to play 3 different roles: an influencing role, a connecting role, and a telling stories of change role. So yes, keeping influencing policy changes, but together with the other roles we want to play. The connector role is a very big part of that, working in alliances, investing in going back to our constituency and leading the example, as we just said, and a stronger link with our local partners to strengthen our advocacy work. And then one word on telling stories of change, really like being in our communication work, in our public work, but also in the way we organize events, in the way we organize meeting with the negotiators, really like bringing stories and bringing hope and not only fear.
Thank you very much. I think I will underline again at the last word that you said is that we need to emphasize on bringing hopes. I think that's quite important for us as faith-based organizations, as faith-based community. I think we shouldn't be promoting hopelessness, but hope. With that, I would like to invite Reverend Grape to explain about the work of the World Council of Churches as well as the response to this Talanoa initiative. Yeah, you have 15 minutes. I think it's
okay. I will not keep that 15 minutes. I will be less, because less is more. And I also think that I would like to hear some comments and have some discussion also from because I very much I agree what have been said very much, and I won't repeat that again. Just bringing up hope, I think that hope is something that you live. It's nothing that you give people. Hope is something that you live together. And I think that is an important way of dealing with hope, to say that is something you live. You live by example, you live by actually doing in the way you think that things should be. I would say that what has been up very much from all of the panelists is to talk about the narrative. I think we are in a kind of clash between narratives in climate change of what way we are going, and I think that the report that we will have in this year about a 1.5 degree from IPCC that have been leakage some of the facts from it is actually going to have a great impact on our discussion, because what I have seen, they will be referring to justice, they will be referring to the impact on the most vulnerable, the poor of the world. So I think that for faith communities and human rights people, I think that we will have very much to deal with in that report. And I think that is also part of the narrative, because the narrative can be, I think the clashes is that some say, well, if we just do this and that small changes, we will, and you say like the business will solve all this, the climate issues. And that is a narrative that some think that is a good narrative, because I don't need to change. We can go, and it's pretty much like we have done for many years. But I think that the real narrative in this case is to say that we are in the front of a big change, in a change of economy, in change of lifestyles, in change of living together on this earth, because the way we have been living when it comes to the limit of the planetary boundaries, we have to actually change, and that is not a change on the surface. That is a deeper change, and that is also why faith communities is so important in this narrative, to say that this challenge that we are confronting is also a challenge that can also lead to a more, what we must come out of it is a more just and a more stable and a more sustainable world. I think that narrative is something that we need. I also think that faith communities, and this also to the Talanoa process, I think it's very much in line with that, is to build trust between different parts of the world and between different actors. One of the main failures in Paris was actually to lose trust. I mean, there was so much action that killed the trust between countries and between peoples. And I think that leading up to Paris, there was very much building on to build trust that we actually can do. I mean, that the down, not the top-down process, the bottom-up process is a part of building trust. But as you also reminded us, this must also be sort of sustained. We need to sustain that trust that the NDCs is actually delivering. And as you all have said, we are not delivering 1.5 degrees and not 2 degrees either with the NDCs now. So that is also a part of building trust. And that's why I think that this COP in Poland is so important for actually to move the implementation of the Paris Agreement. And from faith communities, I think we must be this kind of trust builder and bridge builders for the COP in Poland. And it's a huge challenge with a presidency of the EU country that is the break on climate policies inside EU. As the third time in 10 years they have the presidency. So, and with a more a government that even is more complicated than last time we were in Warsaw. So this is actually something that we have to deal with. So from World Council of Churches, we are actually dealing together with the Conference of European Churches. We are in just some weeks we are going to Poland, and I hope we will have some CIDSI or Catholic representatives and to go to Poland to prepare for the COP in Katowice. Both to meet local faith communities in Katowice, as well as the regional, the country's faith, the Christian Council in Warsaw, and hopefully also to meet with the Minister of Environment, to actually build trust that faith communities are on board on this. We have been for a long time. We are in this together. And we really want also the Polish faith communities to be a part of these actions. I think I will just use these minutes to invite you other to discussions, to have this discussion, because we are doing many things. We have this season of creation that we hopefully will be something that will be a highlight in Assisi. We are just now discussing about to have a summit of church leaders in Assisi, and also a pilgrimage from Assisi to Katowice this time as well. So there are many things in the pipe for what can come out, but it's not all there yet. But we are actually preparing for this COP, because we see it's very important, as well as the Sustainable Living Initiative that Reverend Fletcher told us about earlier. And so just to say, what can we do? I think that the least we can do is all that we can do. So let's do that, and let's have some discussion about how to go further on this. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Reverend Krabbe, for very concrete things that we need to look at the things. toward Katowice in a more constructive way. Without further ado, I would like to invite questions or comments to the three panelists. And just as a reminder, after this we will have lunch break in which the faith-based community or non-faith-based community are invited to have a bit more concrete discussions on how to go about COP24. But now I think it's an opportunity for you to give your comments or to give your views or questions to the panelists. Please. Yes, Attilio. I would like to invite you to speak here so that those on the other line will hear.
I just ask a question about a proposal that was put forward in January last year in Rome by the dicaster of Cardinal Turkson about the campaign for divestment from the companies that are involved with the fossil fuel production or use and invest in the ones that are for the renewable energies. And the consequences to the company, we spoke about the difficulties to involve or to bring the companies to this process, and to ask you if your opinion about this proposal can be helpful for involving them in this process. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Maybe another question, and then we can ask the panelists to respond, if there is any other question. If no, I would like to invite any of you to respond to this very interesting initiative on the divestment from fossil fuel proposed by the Vatican.
Well, I was there to talk about it because we have this experience from Church of Sweden and from WCC to very early to do the divestment from fossil fuel industries. And also that what happened during last year was that many of the Catholic institutions also did some divestment. That was it was a huge news all over the world. Even in the very non-Catholic Sweden, this was on the first line of the news, and the small Catholic communities were invited to a natural radio show to talk about it. But I say, no, we don't know so much about it. But send this Lutheran pastor who is a part of WCC, he knows about. So that's a good ecumenical work, because I was talking for the Roman Catholic Church about the good thing of divestment for them. So that is also a way of linkaging and to do ecumenical work when it comes to divestment. But seriously, I think that divestment is something that is running more or less by itself, because there are also economical reasons to divest, because it's very risky to divest in fossil industry. Even if some forces try to make coal great again, it will not succeed because of economical reasons. And I just read a report this morning that say in 2020, all renewables will be more economical, more suitable economically also, and than fossil fuels investment. So the economy is working on the right way also when it comes to divestment. So for me, it's a no-brainer. It's just to do these days. It was some years ago. It was a statement, ethical statement, but today it's not even an ethical statement. So just go on.
Yeah, Kira.
Yes, thanks for the question. Actually, I also forgot to say that I bring also greetings from Thomas from the Global Catholic Climate Movement, and that you probably know the Global Catholic Climate Movement is putting a lot of effort on the divestment from fossil fuels campaign. So I think what is interesting to say is also that we saw throughout the year, throughout 2017 especially, that this public moment of announcements where we were collecting Catholic institutions that were announcing the divestment were very useful also for our work in terms of keeping certain topics in the agenda. So I think we also, and of course behind the fact of the immediate action of divesting from fossil fuels, there are discussions now on how to keep a better monitoring of those decisions and these announcements. And also I wanted to highlight that we are working together with the Global Catholic Climate Movement in the sense to now deepen the investments side of the work that we are doing. So, for example, SITSE will focus in 2018 on the support to renewable energy systems in the investments side, especially in the framework of the EU budget negotiation for after 2020. So I think what is important is also to keep always the two parts alive of the campaign, so the divestment and the investment side.
Thank you, Chiara. And Yves, please.
Yes, thank you very much. I really agree with the last statement, but I would like to underline how much the divestment must still remain a campaign for several reasons. If we see what has happened, and of course the main example is the tobacco industry, it has been a success for some of the health issues, but then they just moved. And right now we know that we still have a very, very strong problem of tobacco issues in southern countries. So there has been clearly some improvement, and the treaty on this tobacco industry, it remains a masterpiece in international law and probably should be more used. And I know that there has been, in some of the debates within the UNFCCC, some dialogues on that, and I do agree that it's a very good example we have to try to promote much better. But it means, and I really want to underline what Reverend Grubby was saying, is the ethical dimension. I think that there is a very strong movement around the ethical dimension of this divestment. And we know that the economy right now very often thinks it can work, and it can work better without any ethics. And we know that's exactly where it's leading us to a catastrophe. So I think that there is a very important element in this divestment campaign to be continued. And I think some linkages should be done perhaps more, and that's where you were calling for more collective actions with what we're trying to do in the UNFCCC, because some of the dialogue on the question of the conflict of interest, which is a very important one, unfortunately leads, or sometimes there have been some misunderstandings saying, well, all of the companies have a conflict of interest, which of course is an argument that could be has some value, but does not lead us very far. The problem we have is to see industries that are directly linked, and sometimes it's just more than just the oil industry. You have also insurance who are investing or still have interests in the oil, in fossil fuel industries and so on. So we know that it's a hard issue, but the fact of saying that fossil fuel industry must not be involved in the UNFCCC, should not actually have even access to the buildings because they are in direct conflict of interest. Like we don't want to see people still using tobacco in hospitals. You're not allowed to smoke in a hospital. You're not allowed to smoke in a public place. These companies should not be able to access this because they have a direct conflict of interest. Now, we should continue to focus on this and probably to link it with the divestment, because there is a very strong political dimension to this. And we might have more success if we're able to link this than to just have a global debate, because there has been some discussions within UNFCCC on this issue. And unfortunately, it's been more detrimental to access to civil society, because then it shapes the whole discussion and then becomes the discussion between civil society and business, which is not the issue. The issue is that a number of companies and financial interests have no place in this discussion because they make their money out of the death and the destruction of the planet. they must be kept out of the discussion. That does not mean that we think that all of the business should be away. It's another debate, and these two debates should not be connected. And that's why I think the divestment campaign is very important to be also perhaps more linked to some of the dialogues we're having with the UNFCCC. But I also agree that the investment part is also very, very important and should be also coupled there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. If it might also respond to the questions of Natalia from Bolivia from the previous discussion. And now we also have the comments coming from Reverend Fletcher by Skype, which will be read by Valeriane.
Regarding divestment, it is vital that we also recognize the importance of investing, which is what you were just saying, to help solve the climate crisis. A new emerging campaign called SHINE is bringing together faith and foundation investors to invest in clean energy solutions for energy in poor regions. There will be more information available during 2018. Green Faith, the WCC, the World Evangelical Alliance, the Global Catholic Climate Movement, American Jewish World Service, and a growing number of others will be playing important roles in this. Thanks, Fletcher.
Thank you very much, Fletcher. I know that you're watching now. And I think we should come to the end of our discussion. And once again, as Reverend Grabbe said, that we need to start working together. So one of the concrete activities that we will do now during the lunch time is to sit down together to see how to go about Katowice. And understanding that Poland is going to be very interesting in terms of the presidency of the COP24. We've talked about the fossil fuels, etc. Everyone knows about what's happening in with regard to fossil fuels in Poland. So you all are invited for this discussion, but I think Athena is going to make some announcement on that.
So we have our working group meeting. So friends, we would like to invite you to our working group meeting, planning for our faith-based and ethical engagement when it comes to COP24, and this will be taking place in salles 2 and 3, so you just have to go up the stairwell. It's on this side. Lunch will be provided. Thank you again.
Thank you very much to you all. Thank you.